brisk sea breeze whipped across the deck as dawn crept over the western horizon. The ocean seemed endless, a silvery expanse stretching toward the shores of history. In that moment, dozens of vessels braced for the world's greatest gamble, the gamble of freedom. This was the day the tides would change. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the Allied Armada approached the French coast, ready to unleash the largest amphibious assault in human history. The operation that would become known by its codename, Overlord. Today, we stand on the threshold of that epic moment in our story, a world-altering decision made by ordinary men and women who dared to challenge tyranny. Imagine the pounding surf, the rising smoke, the distant rumble of artillery, mingling with the cries of young soldiers stepping off, landing craft into waist-deep water. Picture their hearts racing, their boots finding muddy sand as they charged forward beneath barbed wire and flak. The beaches of Normandy were far more than just patches of coastline. They were the battleground between oppression and liberty, between darkness and dawn. The waves carried the promise of freedom. The waves carried the hopes of people still living under the shadow of dictatorship. As the sun broke through clouds heavy with smoke, 5 key landing zones came into focus: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Thousands of Allied troops, American, British, Canadian, and others, prepared to storm those beaches, to cross into a world where freedom could find its footing again. Behind them were months of planning, intelligence briefings, deception operations meant to confuse the enemy, and countless lives lost and sacrificed in the making of victory. Yet for those aboard those vessels, the moment had arrived. They would face mines, fortified gun emplacements, concrete obstacles designed to rip apart landing craft, and German defenders entrenched and ready. They would face sheer terror. But they would also face hope, not just their own, but that of millions counting on them. And that hope would ripple into history. In this 10-chapter journey, we will follow the story from planning, rooms in London, through to the beaches of Normandy, from peril on the water to triumph on the shore, from the first footsteps into Europe to the dawn of liberation. Each chapter will bring you closer to that fateful morning and beyond. We'll explore the preparation, the deception, the personal tales of courage, the obstacles and the breakthroughs, and the enduring legacy of that day when waves of freedom crashed against the gates of tyranny. Are you ready to embark on this journey? Through one of history's most transformative days, the seeds of D-Day were planted long before the first soldier stepped into the surf. The Allied command knew that Europe could not be freed without an invasion of Nazi-occupied France, a direct strike against Hitler's fortress from the west. But such an undertaking required more than courage. It demanded meticulous planning, coordination on a scale the world had never seen, and secrecy of the highest order. The success of the landings would depend on months of preparation and deception. Every word, every map, every whispered plan carried the weight of freedom itself. In late 1943, as the snow fell over London, military planners from across the Allied nations gathered under one banner: Operation Overlord. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, known simply as CHEF, became the nerve center of the invasion. At its head stood a calm and steady leader, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. His mission was as monumental as it was perilous: to unite a coalition of nations, devise a plan to breach Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and coordinate the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The sheer numbers alone were staggering. Over 150,000 troops, more than 5,000 vessels, 11,000 aircraft, an armada stretching from England's southern coast as far as the eye could see. Each man, each ship, each plane had a precise role in this monumental operation. But what made the invasion truly remarkable was not only its scale, it was the strategy that made it possible. The Allies crafted one of the most elaborate deception campaigns ever executed, codenamed Operation Bodyguard. Its purpose: to convince the Germans that the invasion would strike not Normandy, but Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between England and France. Fake armies were created, complete with inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and fabricated radio traffic. General George S. Patton, known for his fiery personality and reputation, was assigned to lead this phantom army. a force that existed only on paper and in German intelligence reports. The ruse worked brilliantly. While the Germans fortified the Calais coast, the Allies quietly amassed their true invasion force in southern England. Every piece of equipment, every battalion movement was shrouded in secrecy. Even the soldiers themselves didn't know where they would land until the final hours before departure. By the spring of 1944, the pieces were in place. The tide tables had been studied, the moonlight calculated, the weather forecast scrutinized. Every second mattered. As the invasion date approached, a nervous tension gripped every command post and soldier's heart. The fate of Europe now rested on a single irreversible decision. The storm was gathering, and soon the world would change forever. The night before D-Day was a symphony of nerves, silence, and resolve. On the southern shores of England, the air was thick with anticipation. Thousands of young men stood beneath a veil of mist, surrounded by the low hum of engines and the rhythmic crash of waves. They had trained for months, memorized beach layouts drawn in sand, rehearsed assaults on mock fortifications. But nothing could truly prepare them for what lay across the channel. The hours were slipping away, and history was breathing down their necks. Inside command tents and briefing rooms, final orders were being issued. Eisenhower, calm yet solemn, visited groups of paratroopers from the U.S. 101st Airborne Division. His words were measured but filled with the gravity of the moment. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. Many of those soldiers would never forget his voice that night, a mixture of command and compassion. They were about to leap into darkness, scattered behind enemy lines, to open the way for the coming invasion. The weather nearly unraveled it all. Violent winds swept the channel, and heavy seas threatened to delay the operation. On June 4th, Eisenhower postponed the assault. Every hour of delay risked exposure and morale. The tension was unbearable. Then on June 5th, a break appeared in the storm. Meteorologist Group Captain James Stagg predicted a brief window of improved weather, just enough to attempt the crossing. Eisenhower weighed the odds, his commanders waiting in silence. Finally, he spoke the words that would ignite the course of history. "Okay, let's go." Across England, coded messages were transmitted. The invasion was on. Paratroopers were briefed. Naval officers checked their charts. Soldiers wrote last letters home, some folded into pockets, some mailed, most never to be read until long after the guns fell silent. Many prayed. Others simply stared into the darkness, knowing that by this time tomorrow, they would either be heroes or names carved into stone. That night, the skies filled with the thunder of engines. Over 800 aircraft carried nearly 24,000 paratroopers toward Normandy. Below, the vast invasion fleet, over 5,000 ships strong, began to move. The English Channel, once a quiet expanse of water, now pulsed with the heartbeat of an army determined to reclaim a continent. Lights dimmed, engines roared, and the horizon glowed faintly with the promise and peril of dawn. The world was on the brink of liberation. June 6, 1944, 0:15 hours. The night sky over Normandy trembled with the sound of engines. It was happening. The liberation of Europe had begun. From the shadows above, Allied paratroopers drifted down like silent ghosts, their parachutes blooming against the dim starlight. They landed behind enemy lines, scattered across hedgerows and villages, cut off from one another, but united in purpose to seize bridges, disable communication lines, and sow confusion before the main invasion force arrived. On the ground, chaos reigned. Some paratroopers landed miles off target, their units broken apart by strong winds and enemy fire. Others found themselves face to face with German patrols in the dark. The French countryside, quiet only hours before, erupted with gunfire. At Sainte-Mère-Église, one paratrooper, John Steele, famously found himself snagged on a church steeple, dangling helplessly. As the battle raged below, a haunting symbol of the courage and confusion that defined the early hours of D-Day. Out at sea, the greatest armada in history advanced across the Channel. More than 150,000, troops aboard 5,000, ships surged forward under the cover of night. The soldiers huddled together, seasick and silent, their faces pale beneath helmets. The air was cold, the water rough and the horizon distant. Some clutched rosaries, others gripped photographs of loved ones. Many tried not to think about what awaited them on those beaches. Fortified gun nests, minefields, and a storm of bullets. As dawn broke, the coastline of Normandy came into view. At 06:30, the first landing craft hit the sands of Utah Beach and Omaha. Beach for the Americans, Golden Sword for the British, and Juno Beach for the Canadians. The German defenders were waiting. Artillery thundered from the cliffs. Machine guns rattled endlessly. The sea turned crimson as the first waves of troops were cut down before they could even reach dry land. At Omaha Beach, the cost was horrific. The landing craft dropped their ramps, and men rushed forward, only to be met with a hailstorm of lead. Many drowned under the weight of their packs. Others crawled across the sand, seeking cover behind steel obstacles and the bodies of fallen comrades. Officers shouted for men to keep moving, but the beach was a slaughterhouse. For hours, the tide of war seemed to turn against the Allies. Yet even in the face of devastation, courage held the line. Small groups began to push forward, scaling cliffs, cutting through wire, silencing gun positions one by one. Inch by bloody inch they advanced, not for glory but for freedom. The day that would reshape the world had only just begun. The beaches of Normandy were chaos, smoke, fire, blood, and bravery intertwined beneath the relentless storm of war. The first waves of soldiers had been shattered, but still they pushed forward. The Allied invasion hung in the balance, and every moment felt eternal. On Omaha Beach, the situation was near collapse. The carefully planned assault had gone disastrously wrong. Tides had carried landing craft off course, artillery had missed its marks, and communication was nearly impossible. The men who survived the initial barrage were pinned down by withering machine gun fire from the cliffs above. The roar of battle was deafening. Artillery shells screamed overhead, slamming into the surf with thunderous impact. Sand and shrapnel filled the air. Many soldiers lay face down, praying for a miracle, while others crawled forward inch by inch. The cries for medics mixed with the crackle of gunfire, a haunting chorus of courage and suffering. It was, as one veteran later described, hell with the lid off. And yet amid the carnage, something extraordinary happened. Leadership rose not from rank, but from resolve. Junior officers, engineers, even privates began to take command. Men like Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith and Sergeant John Spaulding rallied those around them, finding paths through minefields and gaps in the German defenses. They used the chaos to their advantage, storming pillboxes, tossing grenades, and slowly breaking the German line. At Utah Beach, the story was different. The 4th Infantry Division had landed nearly 2 kilometers south of their intended position, but that mistake proved a blessing. The German defenses there were weaker, and under the cool-headed leadership of Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the troops adapted. "We'll start the war from right here," he famously declared. His calm under fire inspired his men to push inland, securing the beachhead with minimal casualties compared to Omaha. Farther east, British and Canadian forces faced brutal resistance at Juno, Golden Sword Beaches. Tanks bogged down in soft sand, and waves of infantry charged forward through minefields and artillery fire. But by midday they had clawed their way past the sea walls, driving inland toward their key objectives. Every yard gained was paid for in blood, yet the line held and grew stronger. By late afternoon, the beaches of Normandy were no longer Germany's stronghold. They were Allied ground. The foothold in Europe, fragile but real, had been won. Behind them, the sea still raged with ships and the dead. But before them lay the fields of France and the long road to liberation. The tide of history had turned. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were secure, but the real battle had only begun. The Allies had landed over 150,000 troops, but they were still trapped in a narrow strip of coastline, pressed against the sea by German resistance. Ahead lay the hedgerows of Normandy, dense, maze-like embankments of earth and vegetation that turned every field into a fortress. What awaited them inland was no less brutal than the beaches they had just conquered. The German response came swiftly. Elite panzer divisions were ordered toward the front, rumbling across France to push the Allies back into the Channel. The plan was to strike hard before the invaders could build strength. Yet the Germans were crippled by confusion. Thanks to Allied deception, many commanders still believed the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. Hitler himself refused to release key armored units from that region, convinced Normandy was merely a feint. That hesitation gave the Allies their most precious ally, time. As engineers cleared mines and built makeshift harbors known as mulberries, supply ships began unloading tanks, ammunition, and vehicles. On those improvised docks, floating, marvels of steel and ingenuity, an unending flow of men and materiel poured into France. By June 7th, the beachhead was alive with motion, bulldozers pushing sand, medics tending the wounded, and artillery batteries roaring inland. The invasion had become an occupation, and now it was time to expand it. At the same time, across the Norman countryside, paratroopers who had been scattered during the night regrouped. Cut off from command and surrounded by enemy patrols, they turned their isolation into opportunity. Small bands of soldiers ambushed convoys, destroyed bridges, and captured villages one by one. The French resistance, too, rose from the shadows, cutting telephone lines, sabotaging railways, and guiding Allied troops through back roads and forests. The people of France were no longer silent witnesses. They had joined the fight for their own freedom. The days that followed were filled with fierce, grinding combat. Towns like Carentan, Bayeux, and Caen became names carved into memory, scenes of courage and loss. Every hedgerow hid danger, every crossroads cost lives. Yet the Allies pressed forward relentlessly, yard by yard, breaking through Hitler's Atlantic Wall not with a single strike, but with unyielding persistence. By mid-June, the beaches were connected, the foothold firm. The Allies had done the impossible. They had returned to continental Europe. The waves of freedom that struck Normandy were now surging inland, carrying the promise of liberation toward the heart of France. The wall of tyranny was cracking. Normandy's fields, once peaceful and green, had turned into a landscape of fire and ruin. The hedgerows, those thick, ancient walls of earth and shrub, had become deadly traps. Every advance was measured not in miles but in meters. For every village captured, for every hill secured, there was a cost in blood. The liberation of Europe was moving forward, but it was grinding, brutal work. The Germans fought fiercely, their defense anchored by discipline and the terrain itself. The panzer divisions, equipped with Tiger and Panther tanks, struck with devastating precision. Allied troops, many of them young and untested, were learning the true horror of war. The sound of mortars, the scream of artillery, the cries of the wounded, it never ceased. At night, tracer fires streaked across the black sky like fiery scars, and the smell of smoke clung to everything. Still, the Allies adapted. American engineers devised new tactics for breaching the hedgerows, strapping metal blades to the fronts of tanks. Rhino tanks, they called them, capable of ripping through the thick walls of Normandy's fields. British and Canadian forces to the east pushed relentlessly toward Caen, a city whose liberation was crucial to the Allied advance. It was a bitter house-to-house struggle that lasted for weeks, leaving the once beautiful city in ruins. Behind the lines, the human stories unfolded. Medics worked tirelessly in makeshift field hospitals, turning barns into surgery rooms, churches into sanctuaries for the wounded. Letters home were written by candlelight, some filled with hope, others with quiet resignation. "If I don't make it," one soldier wrote, "tell Mom I kept moving forward." And move forward they did. With each passing day, more supplies landed on the beaches. The artificial harbors, the mulberries, proved vital lifelines. Convoys of trucks, nicknamed the Red Ball Express, began hauling ammunition, fuel and rations to the front lines. The machine of liberation was gaining strength, even as the toll climbed higher. But the most powerful weapon in the Allied arsenal was not steel or gunpowder, it was unity. Americans, British, Canadians, Free French, and soldiers from across occupied Europe fought side by side. They shared rations, dug foxholes together, and mourned together. Each of them knew they were part of something far greater than themselves. By July, the Allies had finally broken through the German lines around Caen and Saint-Lô. The road to Paris lay open, but it would not come easily. The enemy was retreating but not defeated. The next phase of the campaign would test not just strategy, but endurance, spirit, and the will to see freedom through to the end. The cost of progress was steep, But the March of Liberty would not stop. By August 1944, the tide of war had shifted entirely. The Allied forces had broken out of the deadly maze of hedgerows and were now sweeping across France like a rising storm. What had begun as a desperate struggle on the beaches had become a full-scale liberation. Tanks roared down dusty country roads, columns of infantry marched past cheering villagers, and the tricolour flag of France began to reappear over towns that had been under the Nazi boot for 4 long years. The breakout, known as Operation Cobra, was the turning point. After weeks of grueling combat in the hedgerows, American General Omar Bradley unleashed a massive aerial bombardment near St. Lo, followed by a lightning-fast armoured assault. The German front lines shattered, Allied tanks poured through the gap, spreading out across the countryside, cutting off retreating German forces and driving deep into occupied territory. For the first time since D-Day, the Allies were moving freely through France. In the chaos of retreat, the German 7th Army fell into disarray. Many units were trapped in what became known as the Falaise Pocket, encircled and pounded from the air and ground. Thousands of enemy troops were captured. Thousands more were killed or fled east. The road to Paris was open, and Eisenhower's commanders saw their chance. But the prize was not just strategic, it was symbolic. The liberation of Paris would signal to the world that France was free again. Inside the city, resistance fighters had already risen up. The French resistance, ordinary. Men and women who had risked everything under occupation now turned their weapons on the German garrison. Gunfire erupted across Paris as barricades sprang up in the streets. The City of Light, long shrouded in darkness, was fighting for its own rebirth. On August 25, 1944, the 2nd French Armored Division, led by General Philippe Leclerc, rolled into Paris alongside American forces. Crowds poured into the streets, waving flags, throwing flowers, weeping with joy. Church bells rang across the city for the first time in years. In the Hôtel de Ville, General Charles de Gaulle stood before the people of his liberated capital and declared, "Paris. Paris outraged. Paris broken. Paris martyred. But Paris liberated." The moment was electric. A city reborn, a nation restored, a dream realized. The long road from the beaches of Normandy had led to the heart of France. Yet even as the celebrations erupted, Eisenhower and his commanders knew the war was far from over. Beyond Paris lay the Rhine, the German border, and the final fortress of tyranny. The waves of freedom had crossed France, but to end the war, they would have to crash upon Germany itself. With Paris liberated, the spirit of victory surged through the Allied ranks, but the shadow of war still loomed large. The enemy had been pushed back but not broken. As the summer of 1944 turned to autumn, Allied troops prepared to carry the fight into Germany itself. Ahead lay rivers, mountains, and a desperate foe determined to make every inch of ground a graveyard. The dream of ending the war was closer than ever, but the road ahead would test every ounce of strength they had left. The first great barrier was the Siegfried Line, a vast network of bunkers, pillboxes and tank traps guarding Germany's western border. Behind it, the Wehrmacht regrouped, reinforced by fanatical SS divisions and newly drafted soldiers, many barely out of their teens. Hitler refused to surrender an inch of ground. Every order he gave now came from denial, not strategy. He would defend the Reich or see it burn trying. For the Allies, momentum was both blessing and burden. Supply lines stretched thin, fuel shortages plagued the advancing armies, and the vast machinery of war struggled to keep pace with its own success. Yet morale remained unbroken. The men who had stormed the beaches and liberated cities now faced forests, thick with fog and fear. In the Hürtgen forest, near the German border, they encountered a nightmare: cold rain, landmines and relentless artillery. Progress was measured in yards and the price was staggering. As the chill of winter set in, Hitler launched one last, desperate counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, under cover of snow and darkness, German tanks smashed through the Ardennes forest, catching the Allies off guard. Entire divisions were cut off, surrounded and frozen in the bitter cold. The small Belgian town of Bastogne became the center of the storm. American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, outnumbered and undersupplied, dug in and refused to yield. When the Germans demanded their surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: nuts. For weeks the battle raged. Snow turned red with blood, and the outcome hung by a thread. But Allied resilience and the sheer will to endure prevailed once more. Reinforcements broke through the German encirclement, and by January 1945, the bulge had been crushed. Hitler's last gamble had failed. The Allies now stood at the gates of Germany. Behind them lay the liberated nations of Europe. Ahead, the Reich itself, the heart of the darkness they had come to destroy. The final chapter of the war was about to begin. The waves of freedom were rolling toward Berlin. Spring 1945. The guns that once roared across Europe were beginning to fall silent. From the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, the waves of freedom had rolled forward, unstoppable, unrelenting and undeniable. Town by town, bridge by bridge, the Allies advanced toward Berlin. Every mile carried the echoes of sacrifice. The young men who had stormed the beaches, the resistance fighters who had risen from the shadows, the families who had endured years under the iron heel of tyranny. Now the end was near. Across the Rhine River, the final barrier to Hitler's fortress, Allied forces launched their assault. The crossings at Remagen, Wesel, and Oppenheim were scenes of thunder and triumph. The bridge at Remagen, captured almost by accident by U.S. troops, became a symbol of destiny, a gateway into the heart of the Reich. As columns of tanks rolled across and artillery thundered in the distance, one truth was clear: the Third Reich was collapsing. In the east, the Red Army surged forward with equal ferocity. Soviet troops pushed through Poland and into Germany from the other side, converging on Berlin. The once mighty Nazi war machine was trapped between two relentless forces, its own brutality now closing in upon it. Cities lay in ruins, and the German people, long fed on lies, began to face the grim cost of war. By late April, Allied and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River near the town of Torgau. Soldiers from both sides, men who had never met but had fought for the same cause, shook hands amid the wreckage of a world at war. It was a quiet, profound moment, a handshake that symbolized not conquest but unity. The world had bled enough. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his Berlin bunker. A week later, on May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The guns went silent. Bells rang. Flags waved. Strangers embraced in the streets. Across Europe, tears of relief mixed with tears of remembrance. Freedom had returned, but at a terrible cost. The soldiers who survived went home changed forever. Some bore scars, others memories too heavy to speak of. But all carried the knowledge that they had stood against darkness and prevailed. Their courage had reshaped the world. The beaches of Normandy, once soaked in blood, now stood quiet beneath the wind, lined with white crosses and endless gratitude. The story of D-Day and the Allied landing of 1944 was not just about strategy or victory, it was about belief. Belief that tyranny could be defeated, that freedom was worth every sacrifice, and that even in humanity's darkest hour, light could rise again. Those waves that crashed upon Normandy's shores still echo today, reminding us that freedom is never given. It is earned, defended, and cherished. Thus ended the longest day, and began the age of liberation. You've just witnessed the day that changed history. Now be part of the mission. Hit subscribe and stand with the waves of freedom.